Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. And this time I'm reviewing the movie Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. I literally just got back from watching the movie, so I promised you guys a review of this film, so let's get right into it. Now, before I continue on, I should say that I have read the book as well. I read the book a couple of months after it came out a few years ago. But I've only read it the one time, and so I've not 100% able to recall all the details, but I do remember the important stuff in the book. Also, I'm going to be talking about some very important spoilers from both the book and the movie here. So if you don't want to be spoiled for that sort of thing, now's the time to turn back. Anyway, with that said, let's get right into it. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. This movie does have some weaknesses, but if you just go into this movie looking for something that's fun and entertaining, then I really don't think you're going to have too awful much to complain about. Benjamin Hunter, who plays Abraham Lincoln, does a really nice job of it. He's definitely capable of the action side of it. He does a nice job of making me feel empathetic with Lincoln and what's going on. And especially when he gets older, they kind of get a little... Basically, the older version of Lincoln is a much more accurate picture of what he looked like in real life compared to his younger days. You can say a lot of things about Lincoln, but he wasn't the best-looking guy in the world, while Benjamin Hunter is a decent-looking fella. Now, also said, talking about some of the people in this movie who I enjoyed, another one, of course, is Dominic Cooper as Henry. Now, if this guy seems familiar to you, but you can't quite place him, I'll give you a hint that he was Howard Stark in the Captain America movie. Again, here Henry is portrayed somewhat differently than in the books. I do think though that I like Henry in the movie better, simply because he has a much stronger presence there. In the book, we spend a lot of time mostly focused on what's going on with Lincoln and his life. Henry is, of course, an important supporting character, but we really don't learn a whole lot about Henry and what his deal is beyond he's a vampire who opposes the evil vampires. And we got a lot of other very nice, good actors going around here. Not besides only. I cannot talk. Honestly, out of everybody in this film, the only person who I could name just by looking at them was Alan Tudyk in his role as Samuel Douglas from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Hang on. I'm sorry, Stephen Douglas. God Almighty. Stephen Douglas, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Well, I'm always glad to see Alan Tudyk. He's a very good actor, very funny guy. I'm just not really sure why he's in this movie. Not that he does a bad job of playing Stephen Douglas. In fact, it's the opposite. But it's just not a terribly big role. And you kind of wonder why they went and got somebody like Alan Tudyk to do it. I guess maybe just to give the movie a little extra geek cred, but I don't know. I mean, Stephen Douglas is a very minor character in this whole thing, and honestly, they could have cut him out, and the film really wouldn't have been all that different. In fact, it might have been even better, since the whole him being Mary Todd's fiance never gets more than a couple of minutes of screen time. But that said, there were some changes from the book. One of the ones that I disliked the most was how in the book Abraham Lincoln kills that first vampire, the vampire that actually kills his mom, when he's still a kid. Here he doesn't kill a vampire until he's an adult. And I liked the way that Abraham Lincoln was able to pull off killing a vampire while he was still a kid. It really showed that he had the intelligence, the thoughtfulness to go in there and do this sort of thing for decades, and on top of all of that, to go out there and become president of the United States. in fact, to become one of the most legendary presidents of the United States. So I honestly thought that, well, in terms of the story they're telling in the movie, that does make sense. Now, I guess I should point out, if you're not aware, that the fellow who wrote the book, Seth Grahame-Smith, is also the one who did the screenplay adaptation of this movie. And spoiler alert, he's the guy in the bar with the gun at the very end of the film, even though you never really do get a good look at him. But anyway, so when he did that, he, of course, added the character of Adam and his sister, and really sort of set them up as kind of supervillains. I was reading a little bit about this before the movie, and in interviews, he's basically said that in a lot of ways this movie is a superhero origin film. And as an aficionado, as you probably know if you're watching this channel of mine, of superheroes, I definitely see a lot of touches from the superhero genre here. I mean, you can definitely see more than a few shades of Batman in Batman Bruce Wayne in this version of Abraham Lincoln. So, that's not a bad thing. If you take this film strictly on its own merits, which I'm trying to do here, I am, of course, going to comment a little bit about the differences from the book, but just take it on its own merits, then this works just fine. Now, granted, calling this vampire the first vampire in the New World, Adam, oh, jeez, I am so freaking sick of that. I mean, how heavy-handed do you need to be? You know, you could have called this guy Mike, and he would have still been an evil, evil bastard. Okay, whatever. Alright, a certain amount of cheesiness is forgivable in situations like this. So I'll let the movie have that one. Another thing that I've seen that some people were complaining about was the very obvious CGI in the horse battle with Bart's. Well, okay, first of all, really, what do you expect them to do here? You can't do stuff like that with real horses. I mean, you cannot have a vampire pick up a horse, use it as a club, and use an actual horse. I mean, just the stuff that they were trying to do. If you try to use a lot of real horses with there, one, you've been putting the horses in genuine danger, and an unacceptable amount of danger, if you ask me, and you've been putting the actors in even more unacceptable danger. Now, don't forget, folks, horses, while normally placid, can seriously hurt people. I mean, people have been trampled to death and kicked to death by horses for thousands of years. A horse is a big animal and has a lot of power in it, so that's why you need to be careful around them. Now, with that said, I thought the horse fight was awesome. I mean, it was completely ridiculous in terms of this could never happen in the real world. But keep in mind, you're having Abraham Lincoln fight battling a vampire while bouncing around on a bunch of horses. Video games are not usually that insane, and you're going to complain about unrealistic stuff? Believe me, I have more to say about that later. Honestly, the only real thing that I can complain about in that scene is that it's supposed to be set in Indiana. Now, as you can tell by my name, Hoosier Jedi, I am originally from Indiana. I was born and raised there. I lived in Indiana for like the first 25 years of my life. I know my home state, and I don't know just exactly where in the hell in Indiana that fight was supposed to be happening based on the geography that was going on in the background there. But you know what? I don't really care. Because this isn't a movie that's supposed to be terribly realistic. This is not a documentary. This is a historical fantasy. This is somebody's crazy tabletop homebrew RPG, Monster Hunter RPG come to life. And so let's continue on with that. I was sort of a little disappointed that the trailer, of course, for the movie really despoils the big, climactic battle on the train at the end. Well, I guess maybe that's not exactly true. it tells us that we're going to have a big climactic battle at the train at the very end. The actual battle itself was pretty intense. There was a lot of really crazy action going on, a lot of butt kicking, a lot of violence, a lot of gruesome vampire killing, and just plain, good guys kicking monster butt fun. And really, that is basically what this movie is meant to be about. It's not meant to be realistic. It's not meant to be a documentary. It's, as I said, it's meant to be a historical fantasy. And it really plays into the line that Lincoln says at the very beginning and at the end of the film, that people prefer legends to men. Now, one of the things that, if you've been paying attention to my channel, that I've said many times is that I don't really like to discuss politics too much, and I certainly don't like to discuss racial issues too much, simply because, well, if you've ever spent time on the internet, you've seen how well that tends to go over. But that said, I did want to say something briefly about, what's going on here in terms of historical accuracy and, the racial issue of all this. And it really does play into what I just said a minute ago about the line, people prefer legends to men. Well, Abraham Lincoln is a man who most people, especially in the U.S., know more by his legend than the actual facts of his life. It's sad to say that, no, Abraham Lincoln wasn't this, endlessly tireless crusader against the evil of slavery. It would be nice if things were like that, but Abraham Lincoln at the end of the day was a man, just like you and I. He was a man he was a complicated person who lived in a complicated time, and his feelings about slavery and the reasons he made the choices that he did in regards to it are something that are still hotly debated today by people who know about these things in far greater detail than I do. And I'm certainly not going to look at this movie as some sort of guide or something that is in any real way meant to be educational or informative about Abraham Lincoln's life and the choices he made in those regards. As I said, this movie is a historical fantasy. So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff in this movie that's not historically accurate. There's all sorts of things that, if they had really happened, we'd have heard about them through history. I mean, they had newspapers, they had photographs, they had all kinds of stuff back then. While there are certainly gaps in our knowledge of that time, the Civil War is fairly well documented. And Abraham Lincoln's actual opinions on slavery, again, as I said, that's something that is hotly debated to this day. But here's the thing. In spite of what Lincoln says about how people prefer legends to men, this is a movie that is not about Abraham Lincoln the man. This is about Abraham Lincoln the legend and turning that legend into a fantasy story, into a horror story, into a superhero story. So yes, there's lots of things that are inaccurate, but the important things, that Abraham Lincoln was a complicated person who tried to do the right thing a lot of the time, that he made mistakes, that he did, for whatever reasons he did them, ultimately do things that did bring an end to slavery in America. And there is no way, shape, or other way of saying that our country, the world, and Americans as a people are better for that having come about. And it's also worth saying that things like, what happened, the stuff with Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, okay, of course that's not accurate to what happened. But look at the greater theme here. Doesn't this movie show to us that there were people, very brave people, of both races, who during that time stood up and said, slavery is wrong, we need to put a stop to this, who risked their lives, and who risked their lives, who risked horrible injury, who risked all kinds of things in order to fight back against that? And does this movie not show us that what the suffering that those slaves went through was real, that it was horrible, and that it was wrong? I say that it does. And given that, again, as I said, that this movie is not a documentary, that it is a fantasy, if it does not let those important themes, those things about which the debate about slavery was really about, if it doesn't let those things just fall by the wayside, if this movie says those things, that freedom is important, that slavery is wrong, that treating other people like property was wrong, and that there were good people of both races who tried and ultimately succeeded in putting an end to it, then aren't any other complaints we could really have about this just whinging? Isn't that what's really important in regards to this movie? I say that it is. Wow, I went off on a big rant there, and now I can't remember what else I wanted to talk about. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about the differences in between the book and the movie. I've had what I had to say about adding Adam and his sister as basically supervillains to the story. Again, it's sort of what's necessary for a movie of this type. And I did like that they do portray the vampires as having a motive beyond we're evil. The vampires want a nation of their own. They even repeatedly say that they want a place that they can call their own. And it is interesting because we're usually in fiction where we see people saying that, usually they're the good guys. And this movie turns that around on its head and makes them the bad guys. And while you can say that aspect of it does make the vampires slightly sympathetic, okay, I'll grant you that. The vampires do have an understandable motive. But look at everything else the vampires do in this movie. You know, they murder children. They treat other living people like cattle, literally. They just do any number of endlessly horrible things. And they're basically looking to build a homeland based on slavery and exploitation of people. So, again, and this is something I think is worth pointing out, an understandable motive is not necessarily, saying that a bad guy has an understandable motive is not necessarily the same as endorsing their motive. Now, I can see from the vampire's perspective why they would want to do this, but saying I understand their motive is not the same as giving approval to it. And the reason I bring this up is I've just seen people make exactly that argument on the internet way too many times. That if you say, I feel sympathy for this bad guy, that it is you automatically endorsing what it is that the bad guy does. No, that's not the case. Now, not that there aren't people out there who, for whatever reason, will take the villain's side and will choose to be ridiculously forgiving for whatever misdeeds the villain might do during the course of the story. And I could list you a humongous laundry list of examples, but I'm not going to. I'm sure we all can think of more than a few examples that we've seen over the years if you've ever paid attention to fandom debates on the internet. I only bring this up because I think it's something that's worth keeping in mind. Now, that brings me to what I think is the thing that bothered me the most about the change from the book to the movie. And I'm going to warn you here, folks. I'm going to drop the biggest spoiler from the book on you right now. So if you don't want to know, if you're thinking about picking up the book, turn away now because this is the really important thing. Okay, now the big deal is that in the book, Henry does indeed turn Lincoln into a vampire after he's shot. Now remember, Lincoln did not die immediately after he was shot. He lingered on for a while before he finally succumbed to his injury. In the book, Henry goes to Abe when that's happening, turns him into a vampire. The being turned into a vampire makes heals Lincoln up, and he and Henry are together, able to continue to fight evil from the shadows of history. And of course, that doesn't happen in the movie. Henry does offer it to Lincoln, but Lincoln just kind of blows him off and then goes off to Ford's Theater to get shot. Honestly, I wish they'd kind of kept the ending from the book, because it was just such a kick-ass ending. To think that Abraham Lincoln as a vampire is still out there somewhere battling the forces of evil. It was just a really good note to go out on in the book, I thought. Here they go for a more poignant ending, but to me it just doesn't really have the same emotional kick, I guess I want to say. Another thing, actually no, there's just one more thing about the changes from the book that I want to talk about, and that is basically that in the book we get a lot more information on the politics of what's going on between the vampires, and the book definitely, of course, focuses a lot more on Abraham Lincoln's rise to the White House, to the presidency. And just the fact that we don't get to see the Union, who are, to put it bluntly, the group of good vampires who are trying to protect America, I was really disappointed by. Because when they got to that part in the book and things started clicking in my head as to what was happening, and when Henry flat out finally says that the good vampires are called the Union, I got a really big kick out of that. I really, really did enjoy that moment. It was like, yes, this is cheesy, but it's so cool. It's so fun. It's so in keeping with so much other stuff that I like. Again, it's sort of very reminiscent of the superhero genre. And yeah, honestly, folks, I think that's really all that I have to say about this movie. Now, while there are flaws in this movie, there's a lot of nice action. The music is pretty decent. Tim Burton, of course, is one of the producers of this film, and you can definitely see some Tim Burton flourishes here and there. But at the end of the day, this is just a fun movie. It's fun to watch. It's a great, historical fantasy. And if you're looking for some kind of inspiration for a historical monster hunting RPG tabletop game, then boy howdy, this movie is definitely a place to mine for ideas and inspiration. Yes, you do have to be willing to go with a lot of things, historical inaccuracies, and all this other stuff. But, complaining about historical inaccuracies in a movie like this is like saying that those historic episodes of Doctor Who were not terribly in keeping with real history. You're completely missing the point if that's your complaint. Anyway, folks, I think that's all that I really have to say here, so I'm going to wrap this up. Overall, I give this movie a thumbs up. If you enjoy this kind of film, definitely check it out. Of course, please comment, rate, and subscribe. You can, of course, follow me on Twitter at HoosierJedi. And until next time, take care and have a good one.